Midnight in Montgomery. January 27th, 1956. A young minister sits alone at his kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. Martin Luther King Jr. is 26 years old. The telephone has been ringing for weeks now, voices in the darkness promising death. Tonight, the fear has followed him from his bed to this quiet kitchen, and he cannot pray it away. His hands tremble. His doctorate from Boston University, his carefully prepared sermons, his proper ministerial bearing, none of it matters here. 3 rooms away, his wife Coretta sleeps with their infant daughter Yolanda. The voices on the phone describe exactly how they will kill them all. This is where it begins, not with triumph, but with terror, not with certainty, but with a man so frightened he can barely hold his cup steady. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. King bows his head over the kitchen table. He prays, but the words feel empty, falling into silence. He has been a minister for barely a year. He came to Montgomery expecting a quiet pastorate, time to write, perhaps teach. Instead, 50 days ago, a seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to surrender her bus seat, and somehow King found himself leading a boycott of every city bus. 50 days. It feels like 50 years. The phone calls started immediately. At first, they were merely ugly, the predictable hatred of men who cannot bear change. But they have grown more specific, more detailed. They know where his daughter sleeps. They know what time Coretta walks to the mailbox. Tonight's caller described the bomb he would place beneath their front porch, the exact angle at which it would tear through the nursery wall. King sits in the silence of his kitchen and feels himself breaking. Consider what courage actually is. We imagine it as the absence of fear, as some natural boldness possessed by heroes. But here, at this midnight table, we see courage for what it truly is. The decision to move forward while every instinct screams to run. King is not unafraid. He is terrified. His faith, which he thought unshakable, feels as fragile as the coffee cup beneath his trembling fingers. He begins to pray again, this time with desperate honesty. He tells God he is afraid. He tells God he cannot do this. He asks God to show him a way out, to release him from this burden he never sought. And then something happens that King will describe for the rest of his life. In the silence of that midnight kitchen, he experiences what he calls a presence. Not a voice, exactly. Not a vision, but an assurance so profound it feels like bedrock appearing beneath his feet. He will later struggle to put it into words, but in this moment, he understands 3 things with absolute clarity. He is not alone, this work is necessary, and he has been prepared for exactly this moment. The fear does not vanish, but it transforms. It becomes something he can carry. 3 days later, King drives his car through downtown Montgomery. He is obeying every traffic law with meticulous care. He signals every turn. He maintains exactly 25 miles per hour in the posted zone. It does not matter. 2 police cars pull him over. The officer claims he was driving 30 miles per hour. King knows he was not. He knows this arrest has been planned. He knows why. They take him to Montgomery County Jail. The segregationists have calculated this move carefully. A young Negro preacher leading a bus boycott let him spend a night in jail. Let him feel what real power means in Alabama. Let his congregation see their minister in handcuffs. Fear, they believe, is contagious. Break the leader, and the movement crumbles. They do not understand what happened at that kitchen table 3 nights ago. Inside the jail, King experiences degradation, designed to break a man's spirit. The fingerprinting, the mug shots, the deliberate slowness of each procedure all calculated to humiliate. The cell is cold, the walls are stained, the smell speaks of human suffering layered over decades. This is where they put Negro criminals, and now they have put a minister here, among thieves and drunkards, because he dared suggest that human beings should not have to surrender bus seats based on the color of their skin. But something unexpected happens. Word spreads through Montgomery's Negro community within minutes. Their minister has been arrested. By the time King's bail hearing occurs, hundreds of people surround the courthouse. They are not ashamed of him. They are proud. His arrest does not weaken the movement. It strengthens it. Every person who came to that courthouse thinking they arrested our preacher for nothing leaves thinking, if they will arrest our preacher for nothing, then none of us are safe until this system changes. The segregationists have made their first miscalculation. They thought jail meant defeat. They did not understand that in the mathematics of nonviolent resistance, unjust imprisonment creates sympathy, generates publicity, and transforms victims into heroes. King emerges from Montgomery County Jail no longer simply a minister. He has become something else, a symbol of resistance. Yes, but more than that. He has discovered something that will shape the next 12 years of his life. The jail cell cannot hold what matters most. They can lock up his body, but his ideas escape through every bar, spreading faster than any force can contain them. 3 weeks pass. The boycott continues. Montgomery's buses roll through the streets empty while 40,000 Negro citizens walk to work, carpool, organize rides through their churches. The economic pressure builds. The city loses money every single day. But the segregationists cannot admit defeat. Instead, they escalate. January 30th, 1956, 9:30 at night. King is across town, speaking at a mass meeting, rallying the boycotters to continue their peaceful protest. At his home on South Jackson Street, Coretta sits in the living room with a church member named Mary Lucy Williams. Baby Yolanda sleeps in the back bedroom. They hear a heavy thud on the front porch. Then the world explodes. The bomb tears through the front of the house. Windows shatter inward like deadly rain. The porch collapses. Smoke and dust fill every room. Coretta grabs Yolanda and runs to the back of the house, her mind calculating, "We are alive! We are alive! We are alive!" Outside, neighbors pour into the street. Within minutes, an angry crowd gathers. Some carry weapons. The white bombers have finally done it, attacked not just the movement, but a family, a baby sleeping in her crib. The mood is explosive. Men talk openly about retaliation. Montgomery stands on the edge of violence that could consume the entire city. King arrives home to find his front porch destroyed, his family shaken, and 300 angry people in his yard. Police Commissioner Clyde Sellers and Mayor W.A. Gale stand nervously at the edge of the crowd, the same men who have fought the boycott, now suddenly responsible for preventing a riot they helped create. This is the moment. Everything depends on what King says next. He climbs onto what remains of his porch. Glass crunches beneath his feet. He can see the rage in the faces before him. Righteous rage, justified rage, the rage that comes when men bomb babies. He could channel that rage. With a single word, he could turn this crowd into an army. Instead, he asks them to go home. "We must meet violence with non-violence," he says. His voice carries across the crowd. "Remember, if I am stopped, this movement will not stop. If I am stopped, our work will not stop. For what we are doing is right. What we are doing is just. And God is with us." He tells them about the kitchen table revelation. He tells them about the presence he felt, the assurance that they are not alone in this struggle. He tells them that their strength comes not from weapons but from the rightness of their cause. The crowd disperses peacefully. No shots are fired. no retaliation occurs. The police commissioner, who came expecting a race riot, stands stunned. In that moment, watching King calm 300 angry people with nothing but words and moral authority, the segregationists begin to understand they are facing something they have never encountered before. The bombing of King's home becomes national news. Suddenly, Montgomery's bus boycott is not a local story about transportation. It is a story about courage, about a young family targeted by terrorists for believing that justice matters more than tradition. Donations pour in from across America. The movement gains strength from the very violence meant to destroy it, and King, the young minister, who trembled at his kitchen table just weeks ago, discovers the strange alchemy of sacrifice. The arrest, the bombing, the constant threats, these do not weaken him. They forge him into something harder, clearer, more focused. He is learning the physics of peaceful revolution, that suffering accepted without retaliation creates a moral force more powerful than any weapon. The boycott continues. 1 month becomes 2. 2 months becomes 6. The city fights back with every legal weapon it possesses. They invoke an old anti-boycott law from 1921, designed to prevent union organizing. On February 21st, 1956, a grand jury indicts 89 boycott leaders. They turn themselves in voluntarily, transforming their mass arrest into a media spectacle. News cameras capture ministers, teachers, and housewives being fingerprinted and photographed. Each arrest strengthens the movement. King's trial becomes a theatre of absurdity. The prosecution's entire case rests on the idea that organizing carpools constitutes an illegal conspiracy. The defense calls witness after witness who describe segregation's daily humiliations. Being forced to pay at the front of the bus, then exit and reboard at the back. Watching drivers close doors and drive away after collecting fares. Hearing drivers call grown men and women boy and worse. The trial puts segregation itself on trial. King is convicted. He is fined $500 plus court costs, sentenced to 386 days of hard labor if he cannot pay. He pays and appeals. The conviction makes headlines across America. The young minister who accepts imprisonment rather than abandon his principles becomes a figure of national fascination. Meanwhile, the buses still run empty. Montgomery's business district withers. Department stores lose customers. The tax base shrinks. The economic mathematics are undeniable. Segregation costs more than integration. But pride and prejudice do not yield to mathematics easily. The city fathers dig in, convinced that maintaining the racial order matters more than prosperity. 381 days. That is how long the boycott lasts. 381 days of walking, carpooling, organizing, sacrificing. 381 days of economic pressure building like water behind a dam. The segregationists fight all the way to the Supreme Court. But on November 13, 1956, the court rules that Alabama's bus segregation laws violate the Constitution. On December 21st, 1956, at 5:55 in the morning, Martin Luther King Jr. boards a Montgomery city bus and sits in the front. Beside him sits Reverend Glenn Smiley, a white minister. The boycott is over. The buses are integrated. But something far more important has been proved. A formula has been demonstrated, tested, refined. Peaceful protest, plus economic pressure, plus willingness to suffer unjust imprisonment equals social change. The movement now possesses a method, a blueprint that can be replicated, and King has discovered his calling. At his kitchen table 1 year ago, he was a frightened young minister contemplating escape. Now he is a leader who has stared down bombers, accepted arrest, and proved that organized non-violent resistance can topple a century-old system of oppression. The jail cell on January 26, 1956, was meant to break him. Instead, it revealed what jail cells cannot hold: the power of an idea whose time has come, the courage of ordinary people choosing to walk rather than accept injustice, and the strange mathematics of sacrifice where suffering multiplied by righteousness equals liberation. Montgomery is just the beginning. King will be arrested 28 more times over the next 12 years. Each arrest will teach him something new about the physics of peaceful revolution. Each imprisonment will plant seeds that grow into movements spreading far beyond Alabama's borders. But it all begins here, in Montgomery's soil, with a young man trembling at a kitchen table who discovers that midnight fear can transform into morning courage, and that the most powerful prisons cannot contain the simple truth that all people deserve dignity. The buses roll through Montgomery with empty seats available to everyone. A movement has been born, a method has been proven, and a minister has found his destiny not in avoiding jail, but in understanding that jail itself could become a pulpit from which justice speaks louder than any church. The segregationists meant to use imprisonment as a weapon. King has transformed it into a tool. That transformation from fear into power, from victim into victor, from trembling minister into movement leader, will echo across decades and continents, teaching future generations that walls built to contain ideas only make those ideas stronger when they inevitably break free. Imagine you are a scientist, studying a new form of energy. You have witnessed something remarkable in your laboratory, a reaction that transforms oppression into liberation, converts suffering into power. You must determine if what worked once can work again, if the formula is reproducible, if the method can scale. This is Martin Luther King Jr. in 1957, standing at the beginning of what will become a decade-long experiment in the physics of social change. Montgomery taught him the basic equation: peaceful resistance plus economic pressure plus willingness to accept imprisonment equals transformation. But science demands replication. One successful experiment proves possibility. Multiple experiments prove principle. King must now test his theory across different cities, different circumstances, different forms of oppression. He does not wait long. In 1957, King helps establish the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. It is essentially a laboratory for nonviolent resistance, a coordinating body that can replicate Montgomery's success across the South. The organization's motto is simple: to redeem the soul of America. But its method is precise, almost mathematical. Study the target, apply pressure, accept suffering, create crisis, force change. The testing begins immediately. September 1958, Montgomery again. King sits in a shoe store, waiting while his wife Coretta tries on shoes. A woman approaches him. She is middle-aged, neatly dressed, carrying a letter opener she has sharpened to a point. Her name is Isola Ware Curry. She asks, "Are you Martin Luther King?" "Yes, I am," he replies. She stabs him in the chest. The blade penetrates his sternum, coming to rest against his aorta, the main artery carrying blood from the heart. Doctors will later tell him that had he sneezed, the blade would have punctured the aorta and he would have drowned in his own blood within minutes. Instead, he remains absolutely still while someone calls an ambulance. He is rushed into surgery. The procedure takes hours. They must remove one of his ribs to extract the blade without killing him. King survives, but the attack teaches him something crucial about his experiment. Non-violent resistance does not mean safety. It means accepting danger without responding with violence. The blade in his chest is data proof that his method will cost him, possibly everything. He has already known this intellectually. Now he knows it in his body. in the scar tissue that will mark him for life. While recovering, he reflects on what Montgomery proved and what remains unproven. The bus boycott worked because it hit segregation where it hurt, the wallet. But can the same method topple other forms of oppression? Can it work in cities where the power structure is more entrenched? Can it force change at the federal level, not just the local? These are the questions that drive his next series of experiments. 1960. Greensboro, North Carolina. 4 college students sit at a Woolworth's lunch counter and politely request service. They are refused because they are Negro. They remain seated. The next day, 25 students join them. The third day, 63. Within 2 months, sit-ins spread to 54 cities across 9 states. 70,000 students participate. 3,600 are arrested. King watches this unfold with the eye of a scientist observing a beautiful proof. The students have independently discovered his formula and applied it to a new variable. They have found another pressure point in the segregated system: lunch counters, where public humiliation meets economic impact. Store owners lose white customers who avoid the protests, but cannot serve black customers without violating segregation laws. The system creates its own impossible contradiction. King joins the Atlanta sit-ins in October 1960. On October 19th, he and 51 others are arrested at Rich's department store. The others are released, but King is held on a technicality he has violated probation from a minor traffic offense. The judge sentences him to 4 months of hard labor at Reidsville State Prison, a facility known for its brutality toward Negro inmates. This is his 3rd significant arrest, and it reveals new dimensions of his experiment. Presidential candidate John F. Kennedy calls Coretta King to express concern. Kennedy's brother Robert calls the judge. Suddenly, King's imprisonment becomes a national issue. He is released after 8 days, and many historians believe Kennedy's intervention, spurred by King's arrest, helps him win the Negro vote that secures his narrow victory over Richard Nixon. King has discovered something profound. His arrests are not just local events, they are national news. Each imprisonment generates attention, sympathy, political pressure. The jail cell has become a lever that can move the entire nation. 1961. The Freedom Riders prove the formula works on federal jurisdiction. 13 riders, 7 Negro, 6 white-board Greyhound, and Trailways buses to test whether interstate travel facilities will obey a Supreme Court ruling against segregation. They know what awaits them. They write wills before departing. They are trained in nonviolent response to beatings. In Anniston, Alabama, a mob firebombs one bus. In Birmingham, riders are beaten with metal pipes for 15 minutes, while police conveniently arrive late. The images shock the nation: white and Negro riders bleeding together, buses burning, segregationist violence exposed in its raw brutality. King does not ride the buses himself. His advisors convince him his strategic leadership is too valuable to risk in the most dangerous action yet. But he provides crucial support, mobilizing resources, generating publicity, maintaining pressure. The Freedom Riders prove that federal law means nothing without people willing to bleed to make it real. Over the summer, more than 400 Freedom Riders are arrested. They fill Mississippi's Parchman prison until authorities don't know what to do with them all. The experiment yields clear results. Mass arrests that overwhelm the system work, fill the jails beyond capacity, and the cost of oppression becomes unbearable. The Interstate Commerce Commission issues new regulations prohibiting segregation in interstate travel facilities. The Freedom Riders' willingness to go to jail has changed federal policy. But King is learning that not all experiments succeed. Albany, Georgia, in 1961 and 62, becomes his first major failure, a failure that teaches him as much as his successes. Albany's police chief, Laurie Pritchett, studies King's methods. He reads about Montgomery, analyzes the sit-ins, understands the freedom rides. Pritchett realizes that King's power comes from exposing violent resistance to peaceful protest. So Pritchett removes the violence from the equation. When protesters march in Albany, police arrest them politely, efficiently, without brutality. When jails fill, Pritchett arranges to use jails in surrounding counties. When King arrives to lead protests, Pritchett treats him with exaggerated courtesy while still arresting him. King is arrested 3 times in Albany. Each time, he expects his imprisonment to generate the crisis that forces change. Each time, Pritchett's strategy neutralizes the effect. There are no fire hoses, no police dogs, no beatings captured on camera, just polite arrests, dispersed prisoners, and a power structure that bends without breaking. The Albany movement achieves little concrete change. King leaves the city in defeat, and critics question whether his methods actually work or if Montgomery was simply luck. Some in the movement argue for more militant tactics. Others worry that non-violence cannot overcome sophisticated opposition. But King, the scientist, studies his failed experiment carefully. He learns crucial lessons. Polite arrests, without moral crisis, generate no pressure for change. The movement needs not just arrests, but visible injustice. It needs not just suffering, but suffering that forces America to choose sides. Most importantly, it needs specific, achievable goals, not vague calls for justice, but concrete demands. Integrate lunch counters, hire Negro clerks, remove whites-only signs. Albany teaches King to refine his formula. Peaceful protest plus economic pressure, plus unjust imprisonment, plus moral crisis equals transformation. You need all the elements. Remove one, and the equation fails. He begins planning his next experiment with obsessive attention to detail. He will not make Albany's mistakes again. He studies the target city with the rigor of a general planning an invasion. He identifies the exact pressure points to strike. He calculates precisely how to generate moral crisis that cannot be ignored. That city is Birmingham, Alabama. And what King learns from his arrests between 1957 and 1962 has prepared him to conduct the most dangerous, most carefully calculated experiment in social transformation America has ever witnessed. Consider what King has discovered through these years of testing his theory. 7 arrests across different cities, hundreds of nights in jail cells, a knife in his chest, death threats by the thousands, and through it all, he has been gathering data, refining methods, understanding the precise mechanics of how oppression converts into liberation. He has learned that nonviolent resistance is not passive, it is active force applied at specific pressure points. He has learned that jail is not punishment but opportunity. Each arrest generates publicity, sympathy, political pressure. He has learned that the movement needs both discipline and spontaneity. The discipline to accept suffering without retaliation, the spontaneity of young people willing to risk everything. Most importantly, he has learned that his opponents will make mistakes. They cannot help themselves. Segregation depends on violence to maintain itself. Ask the system to change peacefully, apply enough pressure, accept enough suffering, and eventually the system will respond with the brutality that reveals its true nature. That moment when dogs attack children, when fire hoses tear at flesh, when police clubs crack skulls, that is when America must finally see what it has built and decide whether to let it stand. The Freedom Riders discovered this formula almost accidentally. Bull Connor's Birmingham police, attacking riders with pipes, generated images that changed federal policy. King now understands this is not accident, but science. Create the conditions for oppression to reveal itself. Document that revelation, Force the nation to witness this is how transformation occurs. Between 1957 and 1960, King has been arrested 7 times. Each arrest has been a lesson, a data point, a refinement of theory. He is no longer the frightened minister who trembled at a kitchen table in Montgomery. He is becoming something else, a strategist who understands that his willingness to go to jail is his greatest weapon, that every cell he occupies becomes a pulpit from which justice preaches to the nation. His opponents think they are punishing him with arrests. They do not understand they are amplifying his message. Every mugshot becomes a recruitment poster. Every bail hearing becomes a press conference. Every jail cell becomes a meditation chamber, where strategy crystallizes into clarity. The formula is proven. It works. Peaceful resistance at carefully chosen pressure points, combined with willingness to accept imprisonment, creates unbearable tension that forces change. The variables are identified. The method is reproducible. Multiple experiments across multiple cities have confirmed the theory. Now comes the supreme test. Birmingham, 1963. King will walk deliberately into jail knowing exactly what he intends to accomplish there. He will orchestrate crisis with precision. He will deploy 6,000 children into the machinery of segregation and force it to reveal its violence before the world. The physics of peaceful revolution have been studied, tested, refined. Now they will be demonstrated at a scale that will crack open the conscience of an entire nation. But first, the scientist must enter his laboratory. And in Birmingham, that laboratory is a jail cell, where King will write 7,000 words that become the moral foundation for everything that follows. From his arrests between 1957 and 1960, King has learned how transformation occurs. In Birmingham, he will prove that understanding can topple a system 100 years in the making. The experiment is ready. The pressure points are identified. The formula is tested. Now comes the moment when theory becomes revolution, when arrests become alchemy, when jail cells become the crucibles where a nation is forced to choose between its ideals and its reality. Montgomery planted the seeds. The arrests between 1957 and 1960 cultivated them, tested them, proved they could grow in different soil. Birmingham will be the harvest, violent, costly, and absolutely necessary. The young minister who once trembled at midnight has become the scientist who understands exactly how to apply force without violence, how to create crisis without chaos, how to make imprisonment the very instrument of liberation. The physics of peaceful revolution are no longer theory. They are proven law, as reliable as gravity, as predictable as mathematics. Push here, in exactly this way, and systems will topple. Accept this much suffering, and walls will crack. Fill jails to this capacity, and structures of oppression will collapse under their own weight. King knows this now. He has tested it repeatedly. The formula works. Birmingham awaits. Birmingham, Alabama, April 1963. The most segregated city in America awaits its reckoning. King calls it Project C. C for confrontation. Everything he has learned in 7 years of arrests, experiments, failures, and victories converges here. Birmingham is not chosen randomly. It is selected with surgical precision because it possesses exactly what the movement needs: entrenched segregation, economic vulnerability, and most importantly, Bull Connor. Eugene Bull Connor serves as Birmingham's Commissioner of Public Safety. He is a man whose commitment to segregation borders on obsession, whose temper is legendary, whose response to peaceful protest is predictable: violence. King has studied him carefully. Albany taught King that polite oppression generates no moral crisis. Bull Connor will not be polite. The plan unfolds with meticulous detail. Target downtown businesses during Easter shopping season maximum economic pressure, fill the jails, systematically overwhelm the system, generate crisis that forces federal intervention, and at the center of it all, King will place himself in jail at precisely the right moment to maximize impact. Good Friday, April 12, 1963. King leads a march through downtown Birmingham knowing exactly what will happen. He has defied a court injunction against protests. He wears denim work clothes instead of his ministerial suit, a deliberate choice signaling he will not post bail quickly. As he walks toward police lines, photographers capture the moment. He is arrested, his 13th major arrest, and this time he has orchestrated every detail. They place him in solitary confinement. The cell is small, dark, cold, no mattress, just a metal bed frame, no communication with the outside world. The isolation is designed to break him, but King has transformed isolation into opportunity before. He asks for a pen and paper. He is refused, so he begins writing on the margins of a newspaper someone has left behind. 8 white Alabama clergymen have published a statement calling King's actions unwise and untimely. They suggest Negro citizens should wait, should pursue change through courts rather than streets, should trust white moderates to eventually do the right thing. Their letter is meant to isolate King, to position him as an extremist whose impatience threatens the possibility of gradual progress. King reads their words in his cell and recognizes this moment. He has been arrested 13 times to reach this point, this convergence of circumstance, location, and moral clarity. He begins to write his response on newspaper margins, on scraps of paper smuggled in by sympathetic guards, on toilet paper. Over 8 days, he writes 7,000 words that become the letter from Birmingham jail, perhaps the most important piece of writing to emerge from the American civil rights movement. "I am in Birmingham because injustice is here," he writes. The words flow from years of accumulated wisdom, from every jail cell he has occupied, from every experiment he has conducted in the physics of social change. He addresses the clergy's call for patience with devastating precision. "For years now I have heard the word, 'wait.' It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see that justice too long delayed is justice denied." He writes about why he cannot wait, describing the daily indignities of segregation with heartbreaking specificity. The moment when you must tell your 6-year-old daughter she cannot go to the public amusement park because it is closed to colored children, and watch her develop a bitterness toward white people. The experience of driving across country and having to sleep in your car because no motel will accept you. The constant awareness that your name is Boy, no matter how old you become. He writes on toilet paper about the difference between just and unjust laws. An unjust law, he explains, is out of harmony with moral law. Segregation laws are unjust because they degrade human personality, because they give the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. Therefore, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws, but to do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. This is why he sits in this cell, not to avoid punishment, but to accept it, to demonstrate that some laws must be broken to honor higher laws, and that accepting imprisonment for breaking unjust laws paradoxically affirms respect for law itself. On newspaper margins, he defends his method of creating tension, what he calls creative tension. Birmingham's white power structure has consistently refused to negotiate, so the movement must create such crisis that the city is forced to confront the issue. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis that a community previously refusing to negotiate is forced to face the issue. He writes about disappointment, his deep disappointment with white moderates who prefer order to justice, who constantly say, I agree with your goals, but not your methods, who live by the myth that time will somehow solve the problem. He has learned that human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through tireless work and the willingness to suffer. The letter, composed across 8 days in solitary confinement on whatever surfaces he can find, becomes a manifesto explaining exactly why 29 arrests across 12 years are necessary, why jail itself becomes the instrument of liberation, why accepting imprisonment transforms the imprisoned into prophets. One day the South will recognize its real heroes, he writes. Not the political leaders who mouth pious words about states' rights, but the people who stood up for what was right, the Rosa Parkses, the elderly women walking instead of riding segregated buses, the young students sitting at lunch counters, the children who will soon march into fire hoses and police dogs to prove that courage belongs to every generation. While King writes on toilet paper in solitary confinement, Birmingham's Negro community mobilizes. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference activist James Bevel proposes something radical: recruit children for the demonstrations. Adults have jobs to lose, mortgages to pay, but children, high school students, middle schoolers, even elementary students, they can fill the jails without destroying family economics. The proposal is controversial. Some movement leaders argue it is too dangerous, too manipulative, morally wrong to place children in harm's way. But Bevel and others understand what King has proven repeatedly. The movement needs bodies willing to go to jail, needs mass arrests that overwhelm the system, needs images that force America to choose sides. On May 2nd, more than 1,000 children leave school and march toward downtown Birmingham. They are trained in nonviolent resistance. They know they will be arrested. Many are excited. This is their chance to be part of history, to matter, to do something meaningful. They sing freedom songs as police load them into wagons. By day's end, 973 children are in jail. May 3rd, the Children's Crusade continues. More than 1,000 children pour into downtown Birmingham, but the jails are full. Bull Connor has no more room for arrests, so he orders fire hoses and police dogs turned on the children. The hoses are set to 100 pounds of pressure per square inch, enough force to tear bark from trees, to knock adult men off their feet, to send children tumbling down streets like leaves in a storm. The water strikes with such force it rips clothing, tears skin. Children are slammed against buildings, rolled along pavement, battered by a weapon that leaves no obvious marks but causes profound damage. Police dogs are released. German shepherds trained to attack, to bite, to terrify. Images capture a teenage boy held by police while a dog tears at his stomach. Other children stand their ground, singing hymns while water batters them. Some are as young as 6 years old. Photographers capture everything. The images appear on front pages across America, on television screens in millions of homes. A young girl knocked down by water pressure, her dress torn, children in their church clothes being attacked by dogs, teenagers battered by streams of water that could strip paint from cars. America is forced to witness what Birmingham has been doing for generations, what segregation has always required: violence against those who dare question it. The moral crisis King has carefully constructed reaches its peak. No one can claim neutrality anymore. The images demand a choice: support this system or condemn it. Birmingham's business leaders panic. Downtown stores are empty. The economic pressure King calculated has become unbearable. The combination of boycotts, demonstrations, and now international condemnation creates losses of $200 million. On May 10th, business leaders reach an agreement with movement leaders, desegregate lunch counters and restrooms, hire Negro clerks, establish a biracial committee to address remaining issues. King emerges from his 13th arrest, having achieved exactly what he planned. The letter from Birmingham jail will be published, reprinted, taught in schools, studied by future movements worldwide. The Children's Crusade has proven that even the youngest can be revolutionaries. The images from Birmingham will haunt America's conscience and push President Kennedy to propose comprehensive civil rights legislation. But the victory is costly. Children have been injured. Families have been torn apart. The violence has been real, the trauma profound. King wrestles with the morality of placing children in danger, of engineering crisis that he knows will generate violence. His answer, written on toilet paper in solitary confinement, is that the violence was always there. He has simply forced America to see it, to acknowledge it, to take responsibility for what it has built and maintained. Birmingham proves the formula works at scale. Fill the jails beyond capacity. Create economic crisis. Generate images that force moral reckoning. Accept suffering without retaliation. Transform imprisonment into testimony. The alchemy is complete. Oppression converted into liberation. Jail cells transformed into pulpits. Children's courage forged into a weapon that cracks open a nation's conscience. The letter written on toilet paper and newspaper margins becomes one of the most important documents in American history, a philosophical justification for civil disobedience that explains why 29 arrests across 12 years are not crimes but acts of profound moral courage. King's 13th arrest has changed everything. Birmingham, the most segregated city in America, has been forced to begin desegregating. The images of children facing fire hoses will push federal civil rights legislation forward. The letter from Birmingham jail has articulated the movement's moral philosophy with such clarity it becomes required reading for anyone who wants to understand why sometimes you must break laws to honor justice. Project C for Confrontation, has succeeded beyond even King's careful calculations. The experiment he began in Montgomery 8 years ago, tested in cities across the South, refined through failure in Albany, has now been demonstrated at a scale that proves it can topple any system, overcome any oppression, transform any society willing to face its own injustice. The scientist has proven his theory. The minister has written his sermon on toilet paper. The movement has recruited its youngest soldiers and discovered they possess courage equal to any adults. And America, watching children battered by water cannons on evening news, must finally decide what kind of nation it wants to be. Birmingham is the laboratory where theory becomes revolution, where arrests become alchemy, where jail cells prove once and for all they cannot contain ideas whose time has come. King walks out of Birmingham having changed the trajectory of American history with nothing more than 7,000 words written on toilet paper and the willingness of children to march singing into violence they know awaits them. The formula is no longer theory. It is demonstrated fact, and the nation will never be the same. August 28, 1963, Washington, District of Columbia. 250,000 people flow toward the Lincoln Memorial, like a river of humanity seeking the sea. They arrive on 73 special trains, 2,000 chartered buses, countless cars that clog every highway leading into the capital. They come from Birmingham and Boston, from California and Mississippi, from every corner of America. White and Negro, young and old, clergy and laborers, famous and unknown, all converging on the National Mall for what will become the largest demonstration for civil rights in American history. Martin Luther King Jr. stands backstage, nervous. He has spoken to thousands before, been arrested 13 times, written letters that changed laws. But this is different. This audience, 250,000 people stretching from the Lincoln Memorial to the Washington Monument, represents the movement's greatest gamble. If violence erupts, if chaos overwhelms order, The backlash could destroy everything Birmingham accomplished. President Kennedy himself worried this march might hurt rather than help the Civil Rights Bill pending in Congress. King carries two speeches. One is typed, carefully crafted, with his advisors, hitting all the necessary political notes. The other exists only in his memory and his heart words about a dream he has shared in smaller venues. Phrases his advisors have told him are too emotional, too much like preaching, not political enough for this moment. He does not yet know which speech he will give. The march has been meticulously organized. Marshals maintain order. Portable toilets are positioned every few yards. First aid stations stand ready. The organizers have prepared for every contingency except the one that matters most: whether America is ready to listen. Consider the precision required to gather 250,000 people in one place peacefully. Every detail calculated: where people will stand, how they will arrive, when they will speak, how long each speech will last. The logistics rival a military operation, but the goal is opposite: not to conquer but to appeal, not to threaten but to testify, not to demand but to dream. By mid-morning, the crowd swells beyond all predictions. The original estimate was 100,000, then 150,000. By the time the program begins, organizers realize they have gathered the largest civil rights demonstration in history. Television cameras position themselves to broadcast this gathering to 96% of American homes. 45 million people will watch what happens here. One by one, speakers approach the microphone. Labor leaders, civil rights activists, celebrities, each contributing their voice to a choir of testimony about why this moment matters, why segregation must end, why America must choose justice over tradition. Then King steps forward. He begins with his prepared text. His voice carries across the vast crowd, amplified by speakers that project his words to the farthest edges of the gathering. He speaks about the promissory note of the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, documents that promised life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to all citizens. America has defaulted on this promissory note when it comes to Negro citizens, he says. We have come to cash this check. He speaks with the precision learned from 13 arrests, from nights in jail cells, from 7,000 words written on toilet paper. He warns against drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. He insists the struggle must be conducted on the high plane of dignity and discipline, that physical force must not meet physical force. The crowd responds, but something is missing. The speech is good, professional, appropriate, but it is not transcendent. It hits the political marks without touching the deeper chord that this moment requires. Then, from behind him, gospel singer Mahalia Jackson shouts, "Tell them about the dream, Martin! Tell them about the dream!" King hears her. He hesitates for just a moment. Then he sets aside his prepared text and reaches for something deeper, something he has shared before in smaller venues, but never on a stage this large, never to an audience this vast. "I still have a dream," he says, and the words transform everything. The dream that his 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. The dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and sons of former slave owners will sit down together at the table of brotherhood. The dream that even Mississippi, sweltering with injustice, can be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. His voice rises and falls with the rhythm of preaching, with the cadence learned in Negro churches across the South. This is not political speech anymore. This is prophecy. This is testimony. This is a minister giving America a vision of what it could become if it chooses to live up to its own ideals. "Let freedom ring," he declares, and then repeats it like a drumbeat, like a hammer striking an anvil, like waves crashing on shore. Let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. The crowd responds with rising intensity. People who came wondering if this march would make a difference now understand they are witnessing history being made, prophecy being spoken, a nation being called to account for the gap between its promises and its practices. When King finishes 17 minutes later, the silence lasts only a moment before applause erupts like thunder. 250,000 people stand as witnesses to words that will be quoted for generations, taught in schools, carved into memorials, studied by future movements around the world. But behind the triumph lies calculation and fear that few in the crowd understand. The march almost did not happen. The Kennedy administration initially opposed it, worried about violence, concerned about political backlash. Movement leaders debated whether gathering so many people was too risky. What if white supremacists attacked? What if police lost control? What if the march gave segregationists ammunition to claim Negroes were demanding too much too fast? King himself carried deep anxiety about this day. Birmingham's success came at tremendous cost. Children injured, families traumatized, a city torn apart. The dream speech he almost did not give emerged from years of wrestling with whether nonviolent resistance could actually transform America, or whether it would only generate more suffering without redemption. The logistics alone could have failed disastrously. 250,000 people need water, restrooms, medical care, security. A single incident, one fight, one provocation, one moment of violence could have turned this triumph into tragedy. The fact that the day passes peacefully represents as much miracle as planning. Yet it works. The march on. Washington achieves what King calculated it could. It applies political pressure on Congress to pass civil rights legislation, demonstrates that the movement can mobilize massive numbers peacefully, and gives America a vision, the dream that transcends policy debates, to touch something deeper about the nation's identity and purpose. 45 million Americans watch on television. 96% of televisions carry the broadcast. The dream speech reaches more people simultaneously than King has reached in all his previous speeches combined. In 17 minutes, he transforms himself from civil rights leader to national prophet, from regional activist to American icon. But King knows that dreams alone do not change laws. The speech must translate into legislative victory. Within 1 year, Congress will pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the most comprehensive civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. The march provides crucial momentum, demonstrating to politicians that millions of Americans support ending segregation, that the movement can organize massive peaceful demonstrations, that ignoring this call for justice is no longer politically tenable. The mathematics King has been refining since Montgomery work at unprecedented scale. 250,000 people marching peacefully create irresistible political pressure. The dream speech generates emotional connection that converts bystanders into supporters. Television broadcast multiplies. Impact exponentially. 45 million witnesses see that this movement is disciplined, dignified, and determined. Yet the cost of reaching this summit has been immense. 13 arrests for King alone. Thousands of others imprisoned. Children facing fire hoses and dogs in Birmingham. Bombs exploding in churches and homes. Deaths and injuries beyond counting. The march represents not just one day's triumph, but years of accumulated suffering transformed into political force. Consider what it means to gather 250,000 people around a dream. Not a detailed policy proposal, not a legislative agenda. A dream simple, powerful, rooted in America's founding documents, but calling the nation to finally honor promises it has made but never kept. King understands that movements need both practical demands and transcendent vision. Birmingham provided the practical pressure. Washington provides the transcendent dream. 3 weeks after the march, on September 15th, a bomb explodes at 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, killing 4 young girls attending Sunday school. Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Carol Denise McNair die in the blast that tears through the church, a direct response to Birmingham's desegregation. The bombing reminds everyone that the dream must be purchased with blood, that speaking truth to power generates violent resistance, that transformation costs more than anyone wants to pay. King attends the funerals, grief-stricken, wrestling again with whether his methods place too many innocents in danger. But he also understands that the bombing, horrific as it is, reveals the moral bankruptcy of segregation. Killing children in a church to preserve racial hierarchy exposes the evil at segregation's core. The deaths of those 4 girls galvanize support for civil rights legislation in ways political speeches never could. This is the terrible alchemy King has learned to navigate. Suffering generates sympathy. Martyrdom creates momentum. Even tragedy can be transformed into catalyst for change. He does not cause the violence segregation's defenders do, but he has learned to position the movement so that when violence comes, as it inevitably does, the nation must witness it and take responsibility for the system that produces such horrors. The Dream speech becomes the most quoted address in American history after Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. It defines King's legacy and the movement's aspiration. But the march itself represents something equally important. Proof that the methods developed in Montgomery, tested across the South, refined through failure and success, can mobilize hundreds of thousands, can reach tens of millions, can pressure the most powerful government on earth to change laws that seemed permanent. King descends from the summit, knowing that dreams alone are not enough. The hard work continues, registering voters in Mississippi, desegregating schools across the South, challenging discrimination in housing and employment. The march has not ended the struggle. It has simply raised the stakes, demonstrated the movement's power, and given America a choice it can no longer avoid. But for one day in August 1963, 250,000 people gathered around a dream and proved that transformation is possible, that America can choose justice over tradition, that words spoken from a heart shaped by 13 arrests and nights in jail cells can reach across differences and touch something universal in the human spirit. The dream rises, the work continues, and King, standing at the summit of his influence, knows that the hardest battles still lie ahead. March 7th, 1965. Selma, Alabama. 600 people stand at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Before them stretches the steel arch spanning the Alabama River, and beyond that, 54 miles to Montgomery, a journey they intend to make on foot to demand voting rights. They know what waits on the other side of that bridge. Everyone knows. State troopers have gathered at the bridge's peak. They wear gas masks and carry clubs. Sheriff Jim Clark's deputies stand ready with cattle prods and whips. The marchers can see them silhouetted against the sky, a wall of uniformed men prepared to stop this march by any means necessary. The marchers begin to walk. Leading them is John Lewis, 25 years old, chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Beside him walks Hosea Williams of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Behind them, 600 people move forward singing hymns, knowing they are walking into violence but choosing to walk anyway. King is not among them. He is in Atlanta, convinced by advisors to delay his participation until legal obstacles are cleared. It is a decision that will haunt him, because what happens next will become one of the civil rights movement's defining moments, and he is not there to witness it. The marchers reach the bridge's peak. Below them, The Alabama River flows indifferent to history being made above it. Ahead, a solid line of state troopers commanded by Major John Cloud blocks the highway. Cloud raises a bullhorn. "This is an unlawful assembly. You have 2 minutes to turn around and go back to your church." John Lewis and those with him kneel to pray. They do not get 2 minutes. Cloud orders his troopers forward. What follows is captured by television cameras and broadcast into American homes during the Sunday evening news. The troopers charge on foot, clubs raised. They strike marchers in the head, in the back, anywhere their clubs can reach. Lewis's skull is fractured, the impact so severe he will carry the scar for the rest of his life. People fall, are trampled, try to crawl away only to be beaten again. Then the tear gas canisters begin exploding. White clouds of choking smoke roll across the bridge. Marchers cannot breathe, cannot see, cannot do anything but stumble backward while troopers keep beating them. Deputies on horseback charge into the crowd, trampling people beneath hooves, swinging bullwhips and cattle prods. The marchers retreat. Some run, others are carried by friends, blood streaming from head wounds. They flee back across the bridge toward Brown Chapel Church in Selma, pursued by mounted deputies who continue attacking even as people reach supposed safety. 17 marchers are hospitalized. 50 more are injured but refuse medical treatment because they cannot afford it or fear white hospitals will not treat them. The nation watches in horror. ABC interrupts its Sunday night movie, Judgment at Nuremberg, about Nazi war crimes to show footage of state troopers beating peaceful marchers on an American bridge. The irony is lost on no one. Americans watching a film about fascism in Germany see their own government committing atrocities in Alabama. The day becomes known as Bloody Sunday. The bridge becomes sacred ground where courage is measured in broken bones and fractured skulls. Where 600 people chose to walk into violence they knew awaited them because voting rights matter more than safety. King watches the footage from Atlanta and knows immediately what he must do. 2 days later, on Tuesday, March 9th, he leads a symbolic march back to the bridge, 1,500 people this time, with clergy from across America joining. When they reach the same spot where the violence occurred, King kneels, prays, then turns the march around. It is a tactical retreat that angers some activists, but prevents another massacre while legal battles continue. That night, white supremacists in Selma attack James Reeb, a white Unitarian minister who came from Boston to join the protests. They beat him with clubs. He dies 2 days later. His death generates national outrage in ways that earlier deaths of Negro activists did not, revealing the painful truth that white martyrs receive more attention than black ones. But Reeb's death, combined with the Bloody Sunday footage, creates the political crisis King has been working toward. President Lyndon Johnson, who has been cautious about pushing voting rights legislation, can no longer delay. On March 15th, 8 days after Bloody Sunday, Johnson addresses a joint session of Congress in prime time. At times, history and fate meet at a single time in a single place to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom, Johnson says. So it was at Lexington and Concord. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama. Then Johnson does something no American president has ever done. He adopts the movement's anthem as his own. "We shall overcome," he declares. The President of the United States, speaking to Congress, embracing the language of the civil rights movement, promising to send voting rights legislation that will finally give federal protection to Negro citizens trying to register to vote. King, watching on television, cries. It is the summit of his political influence, the moment when the movement's methods force the most powerful man in the world to declare, "We shall overcome," before Congress and the nation. On March 21st, protected by federal troops and federalized National Guard, King leads 3,200 marchers out of Selma toward Montgomery. Over 5 days, they walk 54 miles. Each night they camp in fields provided by sympathetic landowners, most of whom are Negro farmers, risking everything to support the march. By the time they reach Montgomery on March 25th, the march has swollen to 25,000 people. King speaks from the steps of the Alabama state capitol, the same building where Jefferson Davis was inaugurated as President of the Confederacy 104 years earlier. The symbolism is deliberate and powerful. On ground where slavery's last stand began, King declares that segregation's time is ending. How long? Not long, he tells the crowd, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. His voice carries across the 25,000 gathered, across television screens to millions watching, across history to future generations who will study this moment. That night, after the triumph, Viola Liuzzo, a white housewife from Detroit who came to Alabama to support the march, is murdered by Ku Klux Klan members while driving marchers back to Selma. Her death, like Reeb's, like the 4 girls killed in Birmingham's church bombing, reminds everyone that progress comes soaked in blood. But the political mechanism is already in motion. On August 6, 1965, President Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act into law. It bans literacy tests, authorizes federal oversight of voter registration in areas where discrimination is systematic, and finally gives teeth to the 15th Amendment's promise that voting rights cannot be denied based on race. The legislation is a direct result of Selma. The Bloody Sunday footage created the moral crisis. The Selma to Montgomery march demonstrated determination. King's 15th arrest, he was jailed in Selma in February for leading voting rights demonstrations, maintained the formula he had perfected: peaceful protest, plus willingness to accept imprisonment, plus moral crisis, equals transformation. But Selma also marks a turning point. The movement is evolving, fragmenting, facing new challenges. Young activists grow impatient with non-violence. Malcolm X, who offered a different vision of Negro liberation, has been assassinated in February 1965. The movement's unity begins to crack under the pressure of partial victories that feel inadequate, measured against centuries of oppression. King himself evolves. The Voting Rights Act secures political rights in the South, but he increasingly recognizes that legal equality means little without economic opportunity. He begins focusing on poverty, on the structural inequalities that persist even when Jim Crow signs come down. This leads him north. Chicago, 1966. King discovers that Northern racism is different from Southern segregation but equally destructive. There are no whites-only signs, but Negro families cannot buy homes in white neighborhoods. There are no segregated lunch counters, but employment discrimination keeps Negro workers in the lowest-paying jobs. Schools are segregated by residential patterns rather than law, but the effect is the same. King moves into a Chicago slum apartment to highlight housing discrimination. He leads marches through white neighborhoods demanding open housing. Unlike the South, where segregation was legal and therefore vulnerable to legal challenges, Northern discrimination is more subtle, more personal, harder to legislate against. In Marquette Park, on August 5, 1966, King leads a march through a white neighborhood. Thousands of white residents attack with bottles, bricks, and rocks. A rock strikes King in the head. He stumbles but continues marching. Later he will say he has never seen hatred as intense as what he witnessed in Chicago, not in Mississippi, not in Alabama, nowhere. The Chicago campaign produces mixed results. Some fair housing concessions are won, but systemic change proves elusive. King realizes that the methods perfected in the South must be adapted for Northern realities. Jail works when laws are clearly unjust. But when discrimination hides behind private choices and economic structures, imprisonment generates less moral clarity. Yet King refuses to abandon nonviolence, even as others in the movement embrace more militant approaches. Urban riots erupt across America: Watts, Detroit, Newark. Frustration explodes into flame. Some activists argue that violence is necessary, that the white power structure only responds to force, that King's methods are too slow, too accommodating. King acknowledges the desperation driving riots, but insists violence is both morally wrong and tactically counterproductive. Riots are the language of the unheard, he says, explaining riots without endorsing them. He argues that nonviolent resistance remains the only path to lasting change, even when that path seems longer and harder than angry voices want to walk. His final campaign brings him to Memphis, Tennessee, in March and April 1968. 1,300 sanitation workers, nearly all Negro, are on strike for better wages and working conditions. 2 workers were recently crushed to death by malfunctioning garbage trucks. The city refuses to negotiate. The workers carry signs with 3 words that capture their demand for basic dignity: "I am a man." King sees in Memphis what he has been talking about for years: the intersection of racial and economic justice. These men are not fighting segregation laws. They are fighting poverty, fighting for the right to earn enough to support their families, fighting to be treated as human beings worthy of respect. On April 3rd, King speaks at Mason Temple Church in Memphis. He seems exhausted, prophetic, aware that time is running short. He talks about the threats he has received, the danger he faces, the certainty that his commitment to justice puts his life at risk. Then he says something that will haunt everyone who hears it. "Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." The next day, April 4th, 1968, at 6:01 in the evening, King steps onto the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. He is preparing to go to dinner. A single bullet strikes him in the jaw, severing his spinal cord. He dies within the hour. He is 39 years old. 29 arrests across 12 years. From Montgomery's midnight kitchen table to Memphis's motel balcony. From frightened young minister to prophet who changed a nation, the arc he traced through American history bends toward justice. But the cost of bending that arc has been measured in suffering, sacrifice, and finally, his life. Bridges crossed, mountains climbed, promised lands glimpsed but not reached. The work continues, unfinished, in the hands of those who follow. 29 arrests, 12 years, 1 life given. Consider what these numbers represent, not just statistics, but a formula for transformation that King discovered, tested, and proved through his own body, his own freedom, his own blood. Each arrest was a lesson. Each night in a jail cell was a laboratory where ideas were refined. Each moment of suffering accepted without retaliation was an experiment in converting oppression into liberation. From the trembling minister at a Montgomery kitchen table to the prophet on a Memphis balcony, King transformed imprisonment from punishment into power. The first arrest taught him that jail cells cannot hold ideas. The 13th, in Birmingham, proved that solitary confinement becomes sacred space where truth writes itself on toilet paper. The final arrests, supporting striking workers in Memphis, demonstrated that the struggle expands beyond racial justice to encompass human dignity in all its forms. But what King created was not just a personal journey. It was a blueprint, a reproducible method for peaceful revolution that has echoed across decades and continents. The alchemy he discovered has a precise formula. Take creative tension, the deliberate increase of societal pressure through peaceful protest at carefully chosen points. Add sacrificial suffering, the willingness to accept imprisonment, violence, even death without retaliation. Combine with moral clarity, specific, achievable demands rooted in universal principles of justice. The result: social transformation. Birmingham alone demonstrates the formula's power. King's arrest generated $1 million in bail bonds as the movement mobilized resources to free imprisoned protesters. 3,000 children arrested, their courage filling jails beyond capacity. Images of fire hoses and police dogs broadcast to 200 million people worldwide. The result? Birmingham businesses lost $200 million, forcing integration that had been deemed impossible. The mathematics are undeniable. Economic pressure plus moral crisis plus mass imprisonment equals systemic change. Remove any element, and the equation fails, as Albany proved when polite arrests generated no crisis. Include all elements, and segregation topples, as Birmingham, Selma, and Montgomery demonstrated. King called it cosmic companionship, the mysterious strength that came when fighting for justice. In jail cells across the South, separated from family, isolated in solitary confinement, threatened with violence or worse, he discovered something he could not fully explain but knew absolutely. He was not alone. There was a presence, a power, a companionship that sustained him when everything else failed. This discovery that unearned suffering redeems, that accepting imprisonment transforms the imprisoned into prophets, became the spiritual foundation of his movement. Jail was not just tactical necessity but moral testimony. Each night spent in a cell was a sermon preached without words, a witness to the conviction that some truths matter more than comfort or safety. The letter from Birmingham jail articulates this understanding with devastating clarity. 7,000 words explaining why accepting unjust imprisonment paradoxically affirms law itself, why creating tension is necessary for growth, why waiting for justice is another way of saying never. Written on newspaper margins and toilet paper, the letter transforms his 13th arrest into one of history's most important philosophical statements about civil disobedience. Consider the courage this required, not just physical bravery, though that was essential. Walking into clubs and dogs and fire hoses demands courage most people cannot imagine. But moral courage, the willingness to be criticized, misunderstood, called extremist and troublemaker, the strength to maintain nonviolence when violence seems justified, to preach love when hatred burns, to insist on human dignity when the world denies it. King's arrests recruited millions to the cause. Each mugshot became a portrait of defiance. Each bail hearing became a press conference. Each conviction became evidence that the system was morally bankrupt. His opponents thought imprisonment would silence him. Instead, it amplified his voice until the whole nation had to listen. The children who marched in Birmingham learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but action despite it. 6,000 young people, some as young as 6 years old, walking into water cannons and police dogs because they understood what adults sometimes forget, that justice matters more than safety, that freedom is worth the cost, that even children can be revolutionaries when the cause is right. Their courage created images that changed history. A teenage boy held by police while a dog tears at his stomach. Young girls in church dresses knocked down by water pressure that could strip bark from trees. Children singing hymns while violence batters them. These images cracked open America's conscience in ways adult protests had not, forcing the nation to see what segregation actually required to maintain itself. The formula proved universal. From King's methods, future movements learned how to topple dictators without firing shots, how to transform suffering into power, How to make imprisonment the instrument of liberation. In Poland, Lech Walesa and the Solidarity movement studied King's tactics. When communist authorities arrested union leaders, workers responded with strikes that paralyzed the economy. Economic pressure applied at precise points, just as King taught. The movement maintained non-violence despite brutal crackdowns. Within a decade, communist rule in Poland collapsed, triggering revolutions across Eastern Europe. In South Africa, Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison, his imprisonment becoming the moral center of the anti-apartheid movement. Like King, Mandela discovered that jail cells cannot contain ideas whose time has come. His arrest, meant to silence opposition, instead galvanized international pressure that eventually toppled apartheid. Mandela explicitly cited King's methods as inspiration, proving the formula works across oceans and cultures. In Serbia, the Otpor movement used King's playbook to overthrow Slobodan Milosevic. Peaceful protests, creative tension, willingness to be arrested. The formula worked again. Milosevic fell in 2000, and Otpor's methods spread to other movements seeking democratic change. Research confirms what King proved through practice. Nonviolent resistance campaigns succeed twice as often as violent ones. 53% success rate compared to 26% for violent campaigns. Peaceful movements generate broader participation because they lower the risk of involvement. They create fewer enemies and make it harder for opponents to justify violent crackdowns. Most importantly, they build foundations for stable democracy because they demonstrate that change can occur through organizing and discipline rather than force. King's 29 arrests created a manual that movements worldwide study like sacred text. How to identify pressure points where peaceful protest generates maximum impact. How to maintain discipline when violence seems justified. How to convert suffering into political power. How to make imprisonment testimony rather than punishment. From Hong Kong to Sudan, from the Arab Spring to Black Lives Matter, organizers invoke King's name and methods. Hong Kong protesters in 2019 studied Birmingham tactics, mass arrests that overwhelm the system, peaceful resistance that exposes authoritarian violence, strategic use of media to generate international pressure. When police arrested thousands, protesters remembered King's lesson. Fill the jails, create crisis, force choices. Black Lives Matter explicitly grounds itself in King's legacy while adapting his methods for new contexts. The movement understands what King proved, that making injustice visible forces society to choose. Videos of police violence serve the same function as Birmingham's fire hoses. They document oppression that has always existed but was easier to ignore when hidden. The protests following George Floyd's murder in 2020 generated the largest civil rights demonstrations in American history, proving King's methods scale beyond anything he could have imagined. Yet his legacy is complicated, contested, continually reinterpreted. Some invoke King to counsel patience and gradual change the very things he fought against. Others use his commitment to nonviolence to delegitimize anger that King himself said was justified, if not its violent expression. He becomes a symbol, sanitized and safe, rather than the radical activist who was arrested 29 times, who called America the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, who insisted that riots are the language of the unheard. The real King was more radical than the icon. He connected racial justice to economic justice, recognizing that integration means little when poverty persists. He opposed the Vietnam War, calling it a symptom of a society more concerned with profits than people. He planned the Poor People's Campaign to unite Americans of all races around economic demands, a campaign cut short by his assassination, but showing where his thinking led. His final arrests, supporting Memphis sanitation workers, revealed the expansion of his vision. These workers were not fighting segregated buses or lunch counters. They were fighting poverty, demanding enough wages to feed their families, insisting on dignity in their labor. King saw that the struggle must address not just legal equality but economic justice, not just civil rights but human rights. Consider what his 29 arrests accomplished beyond specific victories. They demonstrated that ordinary people possess extraordinary power when organized and committed. They proved that suffering accepted without retaliation generates moral authority stronger than any weapon. They showed that jail cells become pulpits when occupied by those fighting for justice. Most importantly, they created a formula that works. Peaceful protest at strategic pressure points, economic boycotts that make injustice expensive, willingness to fill jails beyond capacity, media documentation of the violence that oppression always generates when challenged, international pressure following moral crisis. The result: systems change because maintaining them becomes more costly than dismantling them. This formula has freed nations, toppled dictators, expanded rights for billions of people. It works because it appeals to conscience while applying pressure, because it makes oppression visible while maintaining moral authority, because it demonstrates that power ultimately belongs to those willing to suffer for justice rather than those willing to inflict suffering to maintain injustice. King died at 39, his work unfinished. The promised land he glimpsed from the mountaintop remains distant. Racism persists. Economic inequality grows. The struggle continues. But the seeds he planted keep growing. In every movement that chooses peaceful resistance over violence. In every activist who walks into danger singing hymns. In every person who discovers, as King did in that Montgomery kitchen at midnight, that fear transforms into courage when the cause is just and the companionship cosmic. 29 arrests, each one a lesson, each one a testimony, each one a seed planted in soil that produces harvests. Decades later, in countries King never visited, among people he never met, proving that walls built to imprison bodies cannot contain ideas whose time has come. The alchemy is complete. Oppression converted to liberation. Suffering transformed into power. Jail cells revealed as crucibles where prophets are forged and movements born. The formula works, proven across continents and generations, tested in streets and prisons and churches and bridges, where courage is measured in broken bones, willingly accepted for justice. The minister who trembled at a kitchen table became the prophet who changed the world, not through violence but through its opposite, not by avoiding suffering but by accepting it, not by escaping jail but by transforming what jail means from punishment into testimony, from isolation into companionship, from defeat into the very instrument of victory. His dream echoes still, his methods spread still, his arrests teach still, and the great work continues unfinished, costly, necessary, carried forward by everyone who learns what Martin Luther King Jr. proved 29 times across 12 years. That the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice when people bend it through sacrifice, courage, and the transformative power of suffering accepted without retaliation for a cause larger than any single life. 57 years after Martin Luther King Jr.'s final arrest, his seeds bloom in gardens he never imagined. Hong Kong, 2019. Millions of protesters flood the streets, demanding democracy from an authoritarian government. They wear hard hats and carry umbrellas, not weapons, but shields against tear gas and police batons. When arrested by the thousands, they do not resist violently. They sing. They organize legal support. They fill jails until the system strains under the weight of so many prisoners. The organizers have studied King. They understand his Birmingham formula: peaceful, resistance at strategic pressure points, mass arrests that overwhelm capacity, images of state violence against peaceful protesters generating international pressure. Hong Kong's protesters are arrested in numbers that would have seemed impossible in Montgomery, 10,000 in a single year. Yet they maintain discipline, proving King's methods scale to modern megacities. The movement ultimately fails to achieve full democracy, but it demonstrates something King proved repeatedly. Authoritarian power fears peaceful resistance more than violence. Violence justifies crackdowns. Peaceful protest exposes tyranny's true nature, forcing it to reveal itself through brutality against those who only ask for rights already promised. Sudan, 2019. Protesters gather outside military headquarters demanding civilian rule after decades of dictatorship. They establish a sit-in that lasts weeks, when soldiers eventually disperse them violently, killing over 100 people. The images galvanize rather than defeat the movement. Within months, the dictator falls. Protesters explicitly credit King's methods, the willingness to accept suffering without retaliation, the understanding that moral authority ultimately defeats military power. Serbia, Georgia, Ukraine, the color revolutions of the early 2000s all follow King's playbook. Peaceful mass protest, creative use of symbols and media, willingness to be arrested in numbers that make imprisonment counterproductive. Each movement adapts the formula to local context, but the core remains King's discovery. Suffering accepted for justice transforms the sufferer into a prophet and the system into a defendant before the court of world opinion. Even in failure, his methods teach. The Occupy movement of 2011 lacks the specific demands King learned were essential. It knows what it opposes but struggles to articulate what it seeks. The lesson: moral clarity requires concrete goals, not just general grievances. Movements studying King's arrests understand that Birmingham succeeded because it demanded specific changes. Integrate lunch counters, hire Negro clerks, remove segregation signs. Vague calls for justice generate less pressure than precise demands that can be met or refused. Black Lives Matter, emerging after Trayvon Martin's death in 2012, represents the most direct inheritance of King's legacy in America. The movement understands what King proved. Making injustice visible forces society to choose. When videos document police killing unarmed black citizens, the footage serves the same function as Birmingham's photographs, evidence that the system operates through violence against those it claims to protect. The protests following George Floyd's murder in May 2020 generate the largest demonstrations in American history. Between 15 and 26 million Americans participate. The scale exceeds anything King witnessed, proving his methods work in the age of smartphones and social media. Every police action is documented, every arrest is filmed. The machinery of oppression cannot hide in darkness when everyone carries cameras. Yet questions persist. King's commitment to non-violence seems quaint to some activists who argue that systems built on violence only understand force. Property destruction during some protests raises old debates about whether breaking windows breaks the movement's moral authority. King's answer, refined through 29 arrests, remains: violence is both morally wrong and tactically counterproductive, because it shifts focus from injustice being protested to disorder being created. Research continues to validate his methods. Political scientist Erica Chenoweth's study of hundreds of resistance campaigns confirms what King proved through practice. Non-violent movements succeed twice as often as violent ones. They generate broader participation. Everyone from children to elderly can join peaceful protest, while violence requires specific capabilities and higher risk tolerance. They maintain international support more easily because democratic nations cannot support violent insurgencies. Most crucially, they create foundations for stable democracy because they prove change occurs through organizing rather than force. The formula King discovered remains the most effective method for social transformation yet devised. Not because it avoids cost, King paid with his life, and countless others have been injured, imprisoned, or killed pursuing peaceful change, but because it converts suffering into power, transforms victims into victors, makes imprisonment testimony rather than punishment. Consider what his 29 arrests teach movements today. First, identify precise pressure points where peaceful action generates maximum crisis. Birmingham's lunch counters, Selma's voting registrars, Memphis's sanitation department. Find where the system is vulnerable to economic or political pressure, then apply force there. Second, maintain absolute discipline. One violent act, one thrown brick, one moment of retaliation gives opponents the excuse they seek to delegitimize the movement. King's greatest achievement was not his eloquence, but his ability to organize thousands of people to accept violence without returning it to sing hymns while being beaten, to go limp when attacked, to make their bodies shields for justice rather than weapons against injustice. Third, understand that jail itself becomes the message. Each arrest generates publicity, sympathy, pressure. The letter from Birmingham jail proves that solitary confinement becomes sacred space when occupied by those fighting for justice. Modern activists learn from this. Getting arrested is not failure but testimony, not punishment but proclamation that some truths matter more than freedom. Fourth, create moral crisis that forces choices. Albany failed because polite arrests generated no crisis. Birmingham succeeded because fire hoses and police dogs forced America to see segregation's violence. Modern movements must make injustice visible in ways that compel witnesses to choose sides, not through violence the movement commits, but by exposing violence the system uses to maintain itself. Fifth, combine tactics. Economic pressure alone is insufficient. Montgomery's bus boycott worked because it combined economic pain with moral testimony. Mass arrests alone are insufficient. Filling jails matters only if it generates broader awareness and pressure. The formula requires all elements working together. Peaceful protest, plus economic pressure, plus willingness to suffer, plus media documentation, plus international attention equals transformation. Young activists studying King's arrests discover something his sanitized icon obscures. He was radical, strategic, willing to place children in danger because he calculated that their courage would crack America's conscience. He was not primarily concerned with being liked, but with being effective. He understood that creative tension means making people uncomfortable, that forcing crisis means accepting that some will hate you for it, that achieving justice means disturbing order. His final evolution, connecting racial justice to economic justice, opposing war, organizing poor people of all races, shows where his thinking led. The arrests in Memphis supporting striking workers prove he understood that segregation was symptom, not disease. The disease was a system that valued profit over people, that maintained poverty to ensure cheap labor, that used racism to divide those who should unite around common economic interests. This radical king, arrested 29 times, called communist and agitator, surveilled by the FBI, criticized by moderates who counseled patience, this king is more relevant than the safe icon. Because movements today face systems that absorb symbolic change while maintaining structural inequality, that celebrate diversity while perpetuating poverty, that acknowledge past injustice while resisting present reparations. The seeds he planted grow in unexpected soil. When Iranian women remove headscarves to protest authoritarian rule, they use his methods: peaceful defiance, willingness to be imprisoned, understanding that suffering generates sympathy. When climate activists block highways, they adapt his tactics: creative tension, disruption that forces attention, acceptance of arrest as testimony. When workers organize unions, they follow his final campaign, understanding that economic justice requires collective action and willingness to sacrifice for something larger than individual gain. Not all seeds flourish. Some movements adopting King's methods fail. Authoritarian governments learn too. They study Birmingham and Selma to understand how to suppress peaceful resistance more effectively, how to arrest quietly without creating martyrs, how to use technology to identify and neutralize organizers before movements gain momentum. The formula works, but it is not magic. Success requires timing, organization, strategy, and circumstances that align. Yet the fundamental truth remains: walls built to imprison ideas cannot hold them. King proved this 29 times. Each arrest meant to silence him amplified his voice. Each night in jail refined his understanding. Each moment of suffering accepted without retaliation transformed him from victim to prophet, from prisoner to liberator. The great work continues. In every city where protesters march for justice, in every jail where activists sing freedom songs, in every courtroom where the arrested testify that some laws must be broken to honor higher laws, in every movement that chooses courage over comfort, collective action over individual safety, long-term transformation over short-term peace. 57 years after Memphis, the Promised Land remains distant, but the path is marked by his 29 arrests, by the formula he discovered, by the seeds he planted that bloom wherever people choose peaceful resistance over violent submission, wherever suffering accepted for justice transforms the world. From Montgomery's midnight kitchen table to Memphis's motel balcony, Martin Luther King Jr. walked a path measured in jail cells and broken bones, in children facing fire hoses and marchers crossing bridges, in dreams spoken and promises kept at terrible cost. He proved that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice, but only when people bend it through sacrifice, courage, and the transformative power of suffering, accepted without retaliation. His arrests were not defeats. They were victories disguised as imprisonments, sermons preached from cells, testimonies that echo still in every movement that chooses his methods over easier violence, his patient certainty over despairing rage, his cosmic companionship over lonely isolation. The seeds grow. The work continues. And walls built to contain ideas crumble still, proving what King demonstrated 29 times, that imprisonment cannot hold what matters most, that suffering transforms into power, that justice delayed bends finally toward arrival when people refuse to stop walking, stop marching, stop believing that another world is possible. The minister who trembled became the prophet who transformed. The arrests meant to break him made him unbreakable. The system meant to silence him amplified his voice until it reaches across decades and continents, teaching everyone willing to learn that the longest journey begins with a single step, that the highest mountains are climbed one foot after another, and that the deepest transformations require sacrifices, counted not in comfort surrendered, but in lives given, so that others might finally be free. 29 arrests. One formula. Infinite applications. The seed still growing wherever courage blooms.